Halloween is only a few days away as I sit here, and around my place, the nearness of Halloween means two things. First, a noticeable increase in the rate of consumption of tiny little pieces of candy, and two, monster movies. And around here, specifically, the monster movies we love to watch most of all, especially around Halloween time, are the classic Universal horror movies from the 1930s and 1940s. So today and for the next couple days leading up to Halloween, I'm going to talk about some of those Universal monster movies. And of course, where else could I possibly start but with the movie that, while it was not the first significant American horror film, it wasn't even the first Universal horror film, but it was the film that started the what is normally thought of as the Universal horror franchise. It kicked off the monster movie craze of the 30s and 40s and gave us these great films that we're going to talk about and that we can still enjoy today. That movie, of course, from 1931 is Todd Browning's Dracula, starring Bela Lugosi. Not a great film, I will say, but a great film, not a great film judged on its own merits, I should say, but a great film in terms of its importance, in terms of its influence, in terms of its cultural footprint. In those terms, it may be one of the most successful and most important American films ever made. The film itself, unlike many of the other films in the Universal franchise, and unlike really all of the other films I'm going to talk about in this brief little mini-series of monster movie reviews over the next few days, Dracula's rather dated. Some of the other Universal horror films that I'm going to talk about don't seem nearly as dated. They hold up very well and feel very fresh and contemporary even today. Dracula, unfortunately, is not one of those. Dracula feels very dated. It feels very old and very much a product of its time. It's difficult to imagine, as a modern viewer, how people could have been frightened by Dracula when they saw it for the first time in cinemas in 1931. By the way, it opened on Valentine's Day. It opened on Valentine's Day, 1931. And it was a very popular date movie, and lots of people went to the Dracula show with a date, and it wound up, I imagine, being a very romantic experience, because there they were, frightened to death in the movie theater, in the dark, holding each other close. It's hard to imagine that when you watch it today, because it does seem so stiff and stodgy and very stagey. There are some camera movements. They're early on. There's a cut to the basement of Dracula's castle where the camera pushes into Dracula's tomb, to Dracula's coffin, and that's a little dynamic. And there are a few movements like that here and there. Those are the exceptions. Stylistically, overall, the film feels very still, and the camera feels very locked down and very static. And that's to the detriment, I think, of the film. Although most moviegoers in the popular audience at the time would not have seen movies like Nosferatu, which had been made almost 10 years before this and had a much more dynamic visual sense, and much more dynamic art direction and camera movement, and pace was much more dynamically edited. But most filmgoers who saw Dracula for the first time in 1931 would not have been familiar with Nosferatu. So the thing that we always remember about Browning's Dracula, the one indelible element of it that we are stuck with, for better or worse, to this day, is Bela Lugosi's portrayal of Dracula. It was the definitive interpretation of that character for generations, and in many ways it still is. I mean, the Bela Lugosi Dracula, that is the one that is still to this day imitated, or if a new filmmaker comes along to reinvent Dracula, that is the version that is pushed against, that is used as the starting point for that reinvention and that recreation. Even in a version of Dracula as different from Browning's Dracula as Francis Ford Coppola's Bram Stoker's Dracula from the early 90s, which is just this epic, campy, weird, almost sort of a masterpiece of a movie in a way. Just this of campy weirdness and grand overstatement. Even a movie like that, which is as different from Browning's Dracula as you could possibly be, while still telling basically the same story. contains numerous references to Browning's Dracula, both in a direct sense to relate it to Browning's Dracula, and also in a sense of trying to reference it yet make an inversion or go off in a different direction. I mean, Gary Oldman's portrayal of Dracula could not be further from Bela Lugosi's Dracula in terms of his voice and his mannerisms and his look, his costume design, his character and his motivations. And yet there are repeated references, both in lines of dialogue, ways that Oldman delivers a line, particular scenes that are staged in just such a way to echo or evoke the memory of Browning's Dracula. I mean, Browning's Dracula looms over every version of Dracula made after that. And that is one of the things that makes it the film that you have to talk about. If you're going to talk about Universal horror films, if you're going to talk about Dracula movies, Todd Browning's Dracula is one that you cannot avoid talking about it, because it looms so large, and everything that came after it, every version of Dracula on film made after Todd Browning's Dracula is influenced directly, indirectly, in terms of homage, in terms of response. Everything that comes after is influenced in one way or another by Browning's Dracula from 1931. And when I say that the film itself isn't as good on its own merit as some of the later Universal horror films, or when I say that it hasn't aged particularly well, I don't mean to say that it's a bad film when you watch it today, because it's not a bad film. It does suffer from comparisons to films that followed it in the Universal horror series, but it's not a bad movie. And there are definitely things about it that are worth checking out, that or make it worth going out of your way to see if you have not yet seen the Todd Browning Dracula with Bela Lugosi. And if by some chance you have not seen it yet, I would urge you to see it. A lot of the old Universals are on Netflix streaming currently, so you can check them out there if you've never seen them. And there are other outlets where you can see them as well. I think most of them are on Amazon Instant Video as well, and of course they've been released on DVD numerous times. The art direction, the imagining of Dracula's castle as this ruined, crumbling bunch of brick and stone hung with cobwebs, with tall spiral staircases and old dusty curtains and long tables and sort of dimly lit very atmospherically. The black and white cinematography giving us everything in blacks and grays, looking very dingy. It did not innovate any of that. A lot of that is borrowed from German expressionist films, and a lot of it is borrowed from Nosferatu, F.W. Murnau's great silent horror film from 1922. But again, in the minds of most moviegoers seeing Dracula, they would be encountering these things essentially for the first time. And because it was the vehicle that delivered that image, that milieu, to the public consciousness for the first time, we can fairly credit Browning's Dracula with inspiring that sort of popular perception of horror movies as being places where there are old ruined castles with cobwebs and fog and full moons and baying wolves and things like that. All of those tropes that we would now associate and call cliches with horror films were essentially introduced to the popular consciousness through Todd Browning's Dracula, and it's an important movie for that, and it's a fun movie for that, because you see all of these things that have become touchstones for horror films appearing in a mainstream American film, really for the first time. When we're talking about Browning's Dracula, we also have to mention that there's another movie. There's a second Dracula made in 1931 by Universal, shot on the same sets, and it is the Spanish language version of Dracula. A completely different cast and crew, completely different director, but shot on the same sets at the same time. The English language crew would come and shoot with Bela Lugosi and Dwight Fry and Edward Van Sloan during the day, and then at night the Spanish language crew would come in with a whole different cast and a whole different crew, and they would shoot essentially the same movie. And this was for Spanish language markets. Universal was to release this film internationally in Spanish speaking areas to capitalize on the the film by basically giving the Latin America and the Spanish-speaking world their own version of this American film. And judged on its own merit as a film, it is actually a much better movie than the Todd Browning Dracula. And again, it's something that is well worth you checking out if you have not seen it. And it's really interesting to watch them side by side, or to watch the Browning version and then watch the Spanish language version. And you can really note the improvements that the Spanish language version makes over the English language version. They had the benefit of being able to watch what the English language crew was doing during the day, and then sort of incorporating that into their plans and improving on it. And if you look at the Spanish language version, the camera is much more fluid, much more dynamic, moves a lot more. The shots are a lot more complex. There are more sort of dissolves and matte shots. There are more scenes of Dracula sort of dissolving into mist. There's a lot of what is done off camera in the Browning version is shown on camera in the Spanish language version. It's also edited and shot a lot more dynamically. Scenes are much more complex in terms of how many shots they're built from. Like in the scene where Van Helsing confronts Dracula with the mirror in the top of the cigarette box. In the English language version, the Todd Browning version, this is all shown in a wide shot where Van Helsing opens the cigarette case to offer Dracula a cigarette, and he shows him the mirror where Dracula, of course, casts no reflection, and Dracula stands back and smacks it out of Van Helsing's hand in anger. And in the Spanish language version, it's the exact same thing. Van Helsing shows him the mirror, but Dracula not only stands back and swats it out of Van Helsing's hand with a cane, which is a much more dramatic movement, but we also get a cut to a reaction shot of the mirror. So you can see Van Helsing reflected in one side and Dracula not casting any reflection on the other. And that reaction shot is not there in the Browning version. So it makes it a more complex scene and a more complex shot. And that sort of thing is apparent throughout the Spanish language version. It's definitely technically, and I would say artistically, the superior film to the Browning version. But both films are worth checking out. The Browning version, especially for how influential it was in terms of the art direction, in terms of the style, and just the sort of the trappings of horror films, and bringing a lot of these German expressionistic ideas to American audiences for the first time. Bela Lugosi with a very hammy, very big, but very indelible performance. Not the best of the Universal horror films. I'm going to talk about some better films here coming up in the next few days. But Browning's Dracula, 1931, starring Bela Lugosi, without a doubt, a very enjoyable film even today, and one of the most important, if not the most important, American horror film ever made.